Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Evolution Part 1. Charles Darwin, Neanderthal, see also Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, see also Life Stages, ask its explanations. Part 1.
3rd February 1953 Bowers. Through our incessant explorations we again found this world, as well as also our original homeland, and the very distant descendants of those who, from the earliest time, were the responsible ones who were relevant to the human life of this world, because a portion of the humans of the earth were not born here. Many are descendants of those who came out of the expanse of outer space, and indeed from that space that you name Lyra and Vega with the eye of God, the Ring Nebula. In those territories lie, namely, the real and ultimate original homeland of the later terrestrial human races. Certainly, today, the actual direct descendants of the terrestrial forefathers no longer populate the territory and spaces and systems around the Ring Nebula and the Vega and Lyra heavenly bodies in a space-time shifted configuration. Rather, they live today on space and time-shifted world bodies far on the other side of the system that you name the 7 heavenly bodies' 7 sisters, respectively, the Pleiades, approximately 400 light-years distant. They are the distant descendants of your i.e. Earth humans and our actual original forefathers. Ask its explanations, Part 2. 4th February 1953 Toronto. The might of the Bafath beings, the aforementioned malevolent intelligences in the pyramid at Giza, coming from the distant Ring Nebula region and descendants of the ancestors of Earth's humanity, is very great, and everywhere they know how to exert their influence.
Contact Report 003.
A human being is capable of living for several hundred, or even thousands of years, when it has attained a certain spiritual and consciousness-based relative state of perfection and a correspondingly high and healthy mode of life. But after this stage of about 40 to 60 million years, the spirit no longer needs a purely material body, and it becomes a half-spirit body. It then lives only half materially for another 60 to 80 million years, and in such high spheres that one can no longer get in contact with it from the purely material human vantage point, unless there is a very high level of consciousness-based and spiritual evolution. After 60 to 80 million years, then, the half-spirit, that is to say half-material form, transforms into the first pure spirit form and enters the level of Arahat Atharsata.
Contact Report 007.
My next question deals with the earthly human races. We have here yellow, red, white, brown, and black human beings. How does that come? Why is there this color differentiation?
This actually belongs in the history of Earth humanity, which I wanted to continue to tell you. On Earth, there are not only the 5 color races mentioned by you, it's just that the others are completely unknown to you. In part, they live in places where no human being has been able to find them yet. Partly...
Do you mean that they might perhaps live underground? As for example, the claim goes that this would be the case in Mexico, or that they live under domes in inaccessible mountains or inside of hills, about which also mythological things are told.
Certainly, and here and there these races also step into the world of the sun and mingle with the inhabitants of the surface. Particularly in countries with many different races, they do not attract attention and can move around unencumbered, especially if they veil their faces in the way customary in the country. It gets already more difficult if the color of their face is very noticeable, so for example bluish who
Live in the Indian area, yes?
But further, I wanted to say that some differently colored races already became extinct a long time ago. But in the same way, they are all the product of the celestial suns. That is to say, they were begotten of them, just like the Earth races still existing today. The celestial suns, or starfarers, as we want to call our forebears, were at home on many different planets of stars, in a different space-time configuration, or far away from the Sol system, whereby the planets were fundamentally different in climatic terms. Hence, they also produced other races which were able to adapt to the climate from the beginning. Due to the climate conditions, also a corresponding skin color developed, of which there are innumerable in the universe. Their body sizes were also different, because depending on the gravity of the planet in question, they ranged from only 50 centimeters tall up to several meters. There were and are even beings, which you call gigantic ones, giants or titans, and such beings too once endued the earth with life. They too produced offspring here, but they were gradually exterminated because they were usually very malicious and exercised tyranny. The different color races of today are thus descendants of our variously colored forebears, who came from different planets of foreign stars.
So, then today's human beings on the Earth were not actually created on the Earth alone, and they neither are descended from the apes?
Do you actually believe in this ape-human being theory?
I am not stupid after all. My intellect tells me something different than the crazy brain of a Darwin, who has brought this horror tale to the world and fraudulently underpinned it with falsified bones of apes, which to this day has been concealed and kept secret by the responsible persons.
Well, you are right with your view that the human beings of the Earth are not descendants of the apes. They were partially begotten by our forebears, who also mixed themselves with Earth beings who were simply called Eves at that time. A designation that means nothing other than
The bearing women, or the one giving birth.
sure, but once again you beat me to it. But the Earth beings at that time were of the most diverse forms and kinds. Some of them were completely wild creatures of human-like forms, some of which had been marooned on the Earth in earlier millennia by our forebears, that is, their descendants. These descendants of the marooned were abused by foreign spacefarers, and these fertilized also by genetic manipulation different animal species and produced new life forms by genetic engineering. One of these, by the way, is the ape being still known today, which represents a human-animal mutation, namely the Pan-Paniscus bonobo Char's pygmy chimpanzee. Thus, the ape being is descended from the human being, not vice versa. Other ape beings resulted from natural evolution in the hominid line. Your researchers and scientists have already found many in-between mutations between humans and ape beings, but usually only as skeletons or partial skeletons. These in-between mutations, part human, part ape being, are known to the human beings under names such as Africanus, Peking man, and Neanderthal, and so on. 4 different species of them have survived over all past millennia, and their descendants still live today, although no longer in large hordes, but only isolated or in very small groups. They are so wild and shy that human beings will hardly ever see them. The human beings have coined special names for them, Yeti and so forth. The Eves were, besides Earth-created hominid living creatures, nothing more than very wild descendants of those marooned thousands of years ago, from whom at that time any tools were taken away. They were like wild animals that lived in large hordes. When our forebears finally settled on the Earth, they broke a strict law and inflicted gay vault on these beings. This means that they cast their spell on the female beings, who despite their wildness were somehow beautiful, and mated with them. From this, the first higher developed forebears of today's human beings emerged. They were called Adam in the old language of the forebears, which means human being of earth. For the first of them, this designation then remained as his name, and you still use it today. But since our forebears were mixed races of different colors and sizes, they of course also produced different colors and races of different sizes, completely according to their characteristics. The smallest ones were 50 centimeters tall, while the largest and most vicious ones reached some 12 meters. Their appearance was also varying, and some type of them were only remotely reminiscent to human forms. They were left to die out or were killed if they were too vicious. In many cases, they hid themselves in far remote areas and survived for thousands of years, as their average age was about 1,500 years. But little by little, they also became victims of the time or of the human beings. The last of the vicious ones, whose life was ended with Gewaltsamkeit, died a little more than 230,000 years ago. Today, according to our knowledge, only 7 such beings of the old human life forms still live on the earth, where they remain so well hidden that they will certainly never be found, and will one day die a peaceful death, and that without descendants, because they have become too old and passive for propagation. More common than these gigantic ones, Titanic and Cyclops, as you call them, were the simple giants. They often served great and power-greedy rulers. They were called Goliaths and were especially used for purposes of war.
Contact Report 008.
How did the first life arise?
Your scientists are mostly aware of that.
So, it wasn't just a matter of a living creature being there, but everything developed from a so-called or atmosphere and the amino acids resulting from it?
Sure.
Contact Report 009.
At our 5th contact, I finished the history of humankind at the time when 50,000 years ago, according to earthly calendar, our homeworlds found freedom and peace. Before that time, 70,000 human beings fled under the leadership of the scientist Pelagon. With spaceships, which they had seized, they fled through the space out of another configuration of space and time into the one of the Milky Way of the Dern universe and settled on the Earth. Under Pelagon's leadership, there were 200 sub-leaders, scientists who were each responsible for a specific field of knowledge. Pelagon was unanimously recognized and respected by them and all others as King of Essence of Wisdom, Ish-Wish God. In the course of the millennia, they built large cities and inhabited all continents of the earth. Unfortunately, this only went well for barely 10,000 years before lust for might regained the upper hand and a deadly war raged over the world. Everything without residue was destroyed, and only a few thousand human beings were able to survive, while others fled again into the outer space and into the old space-time configuration and settled on distant worlds. For the next 7,000 years, the Earth was no longer flown to, during which time those who stayed behind became completely wild and degenerated. After that, the descendants of those who had settled on distant worlds returned. Again, they were led by an Ish-Wish. Under such a kind of Ish-Wish command, the distant descendants later built Atlantis and Mu, 2 huge cities on 2 different continents. For thousands of years, they lived in complete friendship and in peace, until some scientists again succumbed to the greed for might and wanted to seize the rule. However, having become tired of the constant wars, the peoples rose against them. Hence they seized spacecrafts and fled into the outer space, according to earthly calendar about 15,000 years ago. For 2 millennia, they and their descendants lived in a neighboring solar system. 2 millennia, during which they had become very evil and were only able to uphold a certain regulation under the strictest discipline. Through mutations and researches, they achieved a very long lifespan, which amounted to more than 3,000 years. Obsessed with imperiousness, they left their world about 13,500 Earth years ago and came back to the Earth. Their supreme leader was the scientist Aras, who was also called the Barbarian. As already Ishwish-Pelagon nearly 190,000 years ago, he also had 200 leaders or sub-leaders who were each responsible for a specific field of knowledge. They settled in 2 parts in the far north and in today's America, Florida, whereby they constantly forged ahead to Atlantis and Mu in order to invade them with war. And only a few millennia after their renewed requisitioning of the Earth, they succeeded in completely destroying Mu and Atlantis. Few survivors went into servitude, while great scientists were able to flee and returned to the original homeworlds in the Pleiades. But thousands of years before that point in time, the new intruders spread across the Earth, and Ishwish-Aras ruled with a firm and bloody hand. But also his sub-leaders usurped all kinds of things and made themselves more and more independent. Within only 3 decades, they acted largely at their own discretion, even though they feared the punishments of the Ishwish-Aras. They pushed very far away from them the codex of preserving their own race pure under all circumstances and not allowing it to fall prey to mutations. Forbidden and secretly, they went out and captured Earth-created life forms, but so also turned wild or mutated beings, which were very distant descendants of former human beings from the outer space. The female creatures, beautiful in their wildness, were tamed and copulated with or fertilized with genetical manipulation by the leaders who called themselves celestial sons. Case by case, depending on their own races, they thus created mutated creatures, completely new life forms that were of dwarfish stature, very gigantic or similar to animal forms. Semjasa, the supreme leader of all sub-leaders, copulated with an EVA, a female creature who, according to his understanding, was still preserved as the most human-like and also quite beautiful one. The descendant of this act was of male gender and a human being in good form. Semjasa called him Adam, which is tantamount to human being of Earth. Another copulation of the same kind brought forth a female creature, and in later years, Semjasa determined that these 2 Adams had to mate together. In the meantime, however, many other creatures of the same kind were conceived, who banded together into large groups and tribes. From them, today's humankind developed, which was already at its beginning, according to its races distributed to the most different continents.
Contact Report 023.
Could it not be that at very early times our Earth once also served extraterrestrial beings as such a planet of banishment?
Sure, your assumption is correct. In primeval times, variously fallible life forms were banished to your Earth from various worlds in the universe, including our race. But these early times can no longer be grasped by us either, and we have no precise data about them.
Contact Report 031.
Every life form must follow the path of its own evolution, even if it leads in some manner to self-destruction.
That sounds a bit crude and perhaps even barbaric. But it makes sense to me, because it is a law that is also anchored in nature. What degenerates negatively will be destroyed by itself if the law is not followed, because it cannot endanger the good life by doing so.
The human life form is a creation of the creation. So it is not descended from animals such as apes, as is so maliciously claimed among you on Earth. The evolution of the human life form is very long when the physical development of form is considered. It was created out of first primitive life, but with the destiny of becoming human, and already enlivened by creational powers in the sense of becoming human. Thus, it was already determined in the first time of the creation that the procreated form had to become human, and ultimately human beings. Thus, this life form is a fundamentally distinct species from the very beginning. Therefore, it was also possible that on Earth at very early times, the wild or feral human life forms could be bred back to the actual human life form by the appearance of new space travelers and their intermingling with them. So human life forms that go feral no longer evolve, but a degeneration takes place, which could be called a devolution, as you said. But this never goes so far as to cause the life form to lose what is actually human, for at a certain point, the degeneration ceases because the subconscious instinct of self-preservation inhibits further retrogression. This point is reached where all conscious knowledge and ability is paralyzed and only material self-preservation prevails.
It is nice to see the home system again, isn't it? Somehow I feel at home on Earth, even though it often seems very foreign to me.
Every life form is tied to its home by feeling impulsations. As low as Earth humans and many other life forms in the innumerable universes are today in their spiritual development, etc., so low were our very early ancestors, from whom Earth humans are actually also descended.
Contact Report 036.
Every life form has to follow the path of its evolution itself.
Contact Report 038.
Every life form is subject to the change of progressive evolution. Subsequently, it collects cognitions and truth. Negative and positive powers become transformed in the balance and therewith, thus, in the power of life and constancy. The path of evolution is very long and burdensome, and it is marked by many kinds of external influences. In particular, the influences of the same kind of life forms exert powers over a single life form, which this life form is only able to control through living through greater spaces of time and teachings from which understanding and recognition result. This course of evolution belongs to the higher and highest life forms, just as it does also to the lower and lowest forms. This is a creational law of evolution, which possesses its validity for all times, and it is never subject to any kind of alterations.
Contact Report 039.
What really is the case with this? By that, I mean whether the Earth human is actually so disproportionate and ugly when he is compared to other life forms in the universe.
The Earth human is a descendant of a human form from the depths of the universe that is very highly developed in every manner. Accordingly, he or she is also highly developed in his or her proportional form. In this connection, he or she is on an equal footing with our own race, which is already approximately 30 million years further developed. Even life forms that are still further developed have no better or more beautiful proportions, and even among them, there are those whom the Earth human would describe as ugly. The proportional beauty of the Earth human was already recognized in ancient Greece, which is why the human beings surpassing this standard of beauty were called Adonis, good-looking ones. At that time, the Earth human was somewhat wild, so the real beauty was only recognized in a few, while those through whom it was recognized were called the beautiful ones, if I use the current Earth human terms for it. At the present time, however, Since the Earth human has discarded his or her greatest wildness and consciously cares for their appearance, their given beauty comes to validity in its entire appearance. So today, in this regard, the majority of Earth humanity can be spoken of as Adonis forms. This refers to the Earth human's physiognomic, shape-related, and proportional appearance. The Earth human is one of the most well-proportioned and best-looking human life forms in the universe, who is only somewhat surpassed by his actual ancestors, who have reached the best possible perfection in proportional regard. The difference, however, is no longer very great, because the material form is subject to limits and cannot be extended. At the earliest times, when the human being of the earth was also produced by his or her indirect ancestors, his or her average age was reckoned at 1,007 years of life, for he or she, trained and informed by his or her progenitors, possessed an enormous level of knowledge and abilities. Unexpectedly quickly, however, they fell to the religions with their erroneous teachings and were thereby deprived of the true knowledge and the truth. They also necessarily began to work against all natural laws, became alienated to them, and lived in a recommendation-breaking and law-breaking manner. Everything together served for the loss of the high average lifespan, which fell lower and lower over the course of thousands of years and leveled off at a 20th of its earlier time. And indeed, especially because many different factors over many thousands of years negatively affected the life and also altered the genes.
Contact Report 041.
When two life forms live together in an alliance, differences of opinion inevitably arise. However, these do not have to ausarten into quarrels, as is so often the case with the Earth human beings. So, without exception, there are also differences of opinion in our marriages. And it would be very abnormal if it were not so. Also with us, like everywhere else, all life forms are varied in their evolution, so never two exactly alike poles are found together. If it were different, it would mean a flattening and abolition of evolution. Thus, two differently directed poles must always come together if evolution is to come about. This means, however, that these two different poles constantly rub against each other so that two different opinions collide, and therefore differences of opinion must arise for the purpose of evolution. This is an irrevocable law of the evolution, to which we and all other life forms in all universes are assigned.
Contact Report 053.
Have you ever heard of the theory that the monkey could descend from humans? It was told to me a few days ago. I know the old crazy Darwinian theory that humans are descended from monkeys. What idiocy. But that the opposite theory is also applied. I do not find that so absurd in the relationship, namely that certain monkey-like creatures, which I would like to call ape-men, such as a certain type of snowman, which I have seen, are actually descended from humans in the form that they have degenerated to the extremely possible state. But I do not want to address the actual monkeys and so-called apes like orangutan, which means forest man, the different gorilla species, the chimpanzees, and the bonobos.
Your question is illogical. On the one hand, you are aware that the human life form corresponds to a special creation act of the creation, and consequently is not derived from any other form of life, nor is it able to return to other forms of life through any natural or unnatural metamorphic processes.
I did not say that. You certainly misunderstood me. I was talking about ape people, not apes.
Sorry, it's my fault. Of course, it is what you say. The monkey forms, however, are no human relative life forms in the sense of a real relationship. They are probably very human-like in their interests, but they are a pure fauna life form, whose earliest origin leads back to the semi-flora world. They are indeed the most highly developed animal forms of this kind on the Earth, at least in the present time.
You mean that other animal forms will develop to such a high level?
Sure, because that is evolutionary according to the development of the planet itself. But this will take more than 1,000,000 years.
A meaningless matter when I consider that I have been walking the earth here and there as a so-called normal person for millions of years. And it is even less important when I consider that billions of years ago I was still wafting around somewhere on a primeval world as an amino acid element, first to become a human archetype through 1,000,000 years, and then slowly to become a body, like human being, who one day was born an absolute idiot and took millions of years to really become normal. What else is a 1,000,000-year-old? I really like to wait, and then at that time I will entertain myself as a new personality with these animal intelligence beasts.
You are funny, but you could not be so wrong with what you said as a joke.
You actually believe this is crazy.
You might wonder.
So, you make me joke, but let's wait for the 1,000,000-year anniversary. I still have some time until then, and time will tell.
Contact Report 055.
Animal, plant and human beings, and also the planet itself go through a process of transformation that causes them to evolve more highly, for evolution can never be changed into retrogressive forms, but always only forward, which means that a transformation is only ever to occur towards a higher level, except when a decline occurs by destruction, etc.
Contact Report 066.
The natural cosmic laws require a uniform and consistent development within the framework of all evolutionary concerns of all levels. This means that the spiritual as well as the material consciousness-based development constantly progress in harmony with each other and must always be in harmony with each other in accordance with the consistency of all things.
Contact Report 069.
But how is it that Earth humans are so small today despite their giant ancestors?
It is primarily the mixing factors with the Earth-originating human forms that are to blame for this, the crossbreeding genuses, as well as all the influences of the Earth itself, which is only able to carry smaller human beings. Through these influences of the Earth, all of our own ancestors also changed in their size, because they were also giants in former times. In the course of the millennia, however, since they lived on Earth and became accustomed to it, they were subject to the alterational influences, so they became noticeably smaller in shape. Thus, we, as late direct descendants of them, show the same average size as their terrestrial humans. There are exceptions, however, also with us, as you know, but also with you, whereby whole nations are affected by it. This is in addition to those breeds that have kept their original size since primeval times as dwarf or giant breeds.
Contact Report 070.
Our early ancestors had mastered space travel for more than 22 million years, carried out expeditions and exploratory flights reaching far into space, and came to Earth for the first time. However, the Earth, was still deep in the late primordial development and was therefore left to time for the further development. Nonetheless, Earth was often revisited to release criminal elements, humans, that were detrimental on the homeworlds. Only a few millennia. However, did this last? And then, for reasons unknown to us, they relinquished the Earth and left this world alone for many millions of years, during which life of all kinds, already developed on Earth, could continue to develop in a natural sense, except that at later times, the abandoned life forms mixed with human-like life forms already on Earth, which happened for the first time a few million years ago.
Contact Report 215.
Guido and I were talking about the prehistoric human beings, respectively the Stone Age humans, and there, The question arose as to when these had actually come so far that they banded together in larger groups, and when these or their descendants built the first smaller and larger settlements, smaller or larger kraals, a rural village, typically consisting of huts surrounded by a stockade or hamlets, etc. In addition, we also came to speak of the first real Ur prehistoric men, if one can actually designate the most distant Ur forefathers of the Earth humans as such. Here, the question then, is how large they actually were, and whether they were already walking upright.
The first human forms, which can already be very well designated in their origin as human beings, emerged around 49 million years ago. Nevertheless, their appearance was not human, but rather in the form that the Earth human knows of the early hominid due to his conceptions, because the first human forms still had nothing comparable with these. In fact, these beings were only about 80 centimeters large, and they partially moved half upright on their legs, and their excessively long arms partially clambered around in the trees. The development of these beings lasted for a very long time, with the most diverse species following from it, which developed into actually recognizable humans in their first species, even the early hominids, as the Earth human imagines them in their early stages, around 8.5 million years ago, while other species of the same genus appeared 4.5 and 6.5 million years ago. There were precursors to these species, but already 12.6 and 16.7 million years ago. From the more distant descendants of all these human forms, who appeared in various places on the Earth, such as in Africa, Australia, Japan, China, America, South America, and in Europe, etc., as you now call these areas, there were already early accumulations of dwellings, settlements, as you say, in which whole kinships gathered together. Such sites are known to us on Earth, and they exhibit an age of 736,000 and of 811,000, 970,000, and 200,000 years.
Contact Report 217.
Recently, we talked about the primeval times of the Earth, and the issue arose, which Simyase also once talked about, that at least once on the Earth, there had been a global glaciation, i.e. a total global ice age, which dates back about 600 million years. At the same time, the entire equatorial belt should have also been covered by many meters of thick ice and by enormous glaciers. This, along with the great ice ages and the small ice ages that repeatedly moved across the planet since ages ago, and will also continue to do so in the future. Through the total glaciation of global expansion, the entire Earth became a giant ball of ice, i.e. an actual ice planet. In addition, I ask you, since you are also a geologist and an expert in terms of the ice ages and so on, how the Earth was able to turn into an ice planet at all, and how the enormous masses of ice were able to melt and then disappear again. At the earliest times, the planet was, nevertheless, a giant glowing ball, before it solidified and formed actual land masses, on which then, in the end, mountains raised themselves through inner Earth movements and processes, etc.
It corresponds to the truth that at early times on the Earth, the ice regions and glaciers had advanced into the tropical zones and also forced the equatorial regions and even the entire planet under a mantle of ice that was many meters thick. Now, so that the Earth could free itself again from its enormous mantle of ice, the elementary, bubbling, inner life of the planet itself was decisive, namely the tremendous natural power of volcanism, through which the tremendous heat was generated, which eventually brought the ice crust of the Earth back to melting. But in addition to the lava and the heat, the volcanoes also eject huge amounts of the finest dust particles, that is to say, ash particles and so on and so forth, along with enormous masses of carbon dioxide, and these very factors are the ones that ensure that the heat of the sunlight is trapped in the atmosphere. But primarily, it is carbon dioxide that is decisive for this heat effect, for throughout the entire global ice age, which lasted on Earth for 12.47 million years, this gathered together in unimaginable mass in the atmosphere, heating it to about 57 degrees, which entailed that a tremendous global greenhouse effect arose, through which the enormous masses of ice slowly began to melt. By what means the global freezing dissolved up to the small areas at the North Pole and the South Pole, as well as in isolated mountain areas, etc. This was also the case on the ground, which took place about 600 million years ago. Of course, immense layers of clouds originated from the slow evaporation of the masses of ice, which surrounded the entire Earth as a closed cloud cover and which, in turn, led to a renewed and even much more extreme climate change. Then, after many millions of years, it began to rain for the first time on Earth, and indeed, in such immense masses that everything was set under water. This tremendous time of rain, during which the waters fell like a flood from the clouds to the ground, lasted for 142 years without interruption, and of course, new evaporations of the falling down water masses took place again and again, by what means the cloud formations were continuously fed, while the powerful volcanoes naturally remained active and constantly ejected new carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The flood-like falling down water masses combined in the atmosphere with this carbon dioxide, forming acid rain, from which then, over the course of time, natural lime developed on the Earth. This was the development of the Earth in relation to the total global freezing, which then also firstly formed the actual origin for the original emergence of the first microlife forms of a single-celled kind, from which, over the course of millions of years and centuries, life forms of the water, land, and air evolved up to the higher kinds, after which then the Earth human emerged from the whole thing and evolved over many depths and heights to the current state. Until the global ice age around 600 million years ago, only thermal life forms, that is to say thermal bacteria, existed on the Earth in the scorching heat of the magma and lava, and these life forms were partially expelled from the hot springs of above-ground geysers, as well as from small or larger black funnels or chimneys rising high up at the bottom of the sea, and to be sure, along with the other primitive forms, from which, over the course of time, new unicellular life forms could evolve, which settled in the sands of the shores of the seas and other bodies of water, and evolved under or in the sand to multicellular life forms. But at the same time, comets as well as meteors and asteroids as well as interstellar clouds of microbes played a very important role once these came into the immediate vicinity of the Earth and fell down upon this, thereby bringing their microbes, etc. to the planet, which combined in part with the Earth's already developed life forms of a similar kind, and thereby created new life, or else life forms that were independently brought from space emerged from these. But in relation to the insemination of the Earth with respect to fauna and flora, it must be clearly said that what primarily relates to this did not proceed from the planet itself, but resulted through the inclusions from outer space, and to be sure, through comets, meteors, asteroids, dust particles, and even through the clouds of chemical elements drifting through free space as well as clouds of microbes, through which all the bacteria, fungi, lichens, mosses, viruses, and protozoa of various genera and species were brought to the Earth. The Earth human first emerged much later out of new amino acid connections, etc., which resulted from the decayed substances of plants and animals. The earliest human forms in this regard, which emerged from the planet itself, are to be backdated to 8 to 12 million years. But the actual hominid forms first appeared between 6 and 8 million years ago, from whose lines various human forms then developed over the course of time. But these were not of permanence, and thus passed again. Then, from the same original line, still other and similar human life forms formed, so with the related human life forms, namely the simian beings, which still exist on the earth today in various species. The human beings who walked the earth at earlier times, such as over 20 or 120 or even more than 230 million years ago, were in no wise the so-called earth-made or earth-created ones, but rather extraterrestrials who came from the depths of space and who stayed here for a certain time or only visited the planet for a short time, for expeditions or for major excursions. At that time, the areas of origin and home worlds of these travelers from afar were to be found in your galaxy, so the Milky Way, but also in foreign galaxies.
So once more, from your words, it again follows clearly and plainly that humans are not descended from the ape line, but rather apes from the human line.
That is correct, because the Darwinian theory of evolution, that the evolutionary line of Earth humans traces back to apes, is fundamentally wrong, for in truth, the evolutionary line of apes traces back to human beings. Darwin was a deceiver in relation to the human-ape evolutionary line theory because he secretly worked on ape bones and ape skeletons with a filing utensil, in order to adapt them into his claim and false theory, and to present it to those scientists at that time who occupied themselves with the evolution of animals and humans. At first, they were completely impressed by Darwin's evidence, and spread Darwin's false claims and deceitful machinations across the globe as correct and as a true sensation. And once they discovered Charles R. Darwin's fraud, it was already too late to correct everything again. Consequently, everything took its course, and the fraudulently created evidence entered into the scientific annals as authenticity. Thus, it also spread among the people, and the erroneous teaching was born that the human being is descended from the ape, which is the exact opposite of what corresponds to the truth and correctness, that the ape is descended from the line of the human being.
Contact Report 218.
But there are, among many other very interesting things, also the black things chimneys, also known as black smokers, of which Quetzal had once spoken, and he said that they are the essential origin of the later forms of life on the earth, in water, air, and land, along with inclusions from outer space through comets, meteors, and asteroids. In these black things, chimneys, from which pitch-black swathes, which are impregnated with sulfur and various materials, rise up, emerged early branches of bacteria which, as they rose out of the chimneys, were released and began the evolutionary work of life.
Contact Report 222.
As it follows from your explanations, life on Earth originated in the water, whereby it then developed in the shore sand of the waters. This is in complete contrast to the claims of the earthly scientists, whose explanations purport that life had developed from the so-called primordial soup. If I still remember correctly, completely in accordance with your information, life is to have originated in the fresh waters of the earth. Seas, however, are very salty, at least here on Earth, whereby the highly sensitive genetic material and outer covers of the first organisms would have probably been destroyed because salt water is extremely aggressive, and the life forms that emerged first were still highly susceptible to such influences. So I ask myself, what type of water was given then, in which life could evolve, before it could also find its way in salt water at a later time?
The salt water of primeval times was actually very aggressive in the primordial seas and contained values that were 2 and 3 times as high as those of the current salt concentrations in the earthly seas. Thus, life also did not originate in these salty primordial seas, which were also partly strong in potassium, but rather in smaller and larger land waters, in small and large ponds, as well as in small or larger lakes, which consisted of fresh water that arose from torrential rains.
Contact Report 224.
As a rule, comets and meteors are carriers of microorganisms that, if they inseminate planets and moons, immensely multiply in conditions that are favorable for them, and gradually change themselves and mutate, or, in the course of their secretions, create new substances and new forms, which form new life in unions, etc. with other forms, from which higher life develops over the course of hundreds of thousands and millions of years, if the necessary conditions are given on the planets and moons, so particularly climate, temperature, and food. Thus, there is life that is only in the light, and other life that can only live in total darkness, while others can only exist in intense heat or cold. Others can only exist in water, in gases, in soft or hard matter, while others can only live in external spheres, etc. And as it happens universe-wide with the insemination of the planets and moons by comets, wandering planets, and meteors, as well as by clouds of microorganisms, which drift through space, so it has also happened on our Earth. First through this was it possible that life could develop from the planet itself. So if it is said that the Earth created life from itself, then this is to be understood in the sense that first, it became inseminated by microorganisms from outer space, precisely through comets, wandering planets, meteors, and clouds of microorganisms, etc., which then multiplied on our planet when conditions that were life-favorable for them were created by this. Primarily included in these favorable conditions was volcanism, in which thermal microorganisms romped about, from whose effects, however, also climatic and atmospheric forms and layers, etc. developed, and after this developed lichens and mosses and later higher plants, and after that the animal forms, and at last human beings were able to develop. Mainland life emerged here in the sandy shore layers of the seas and other waters, but this earthly original form of life first developed in the primeval waters, which still would have been undrinkable and deadly for humans and for actual animals. This process of the origin of life on Earth is likewise given throughout the whole universe. So thus, there are micro-organic as well as low and higher and even high life forms elsewhere on other worlds, and with these also humans, as your existence probably proves sufficiently, and indeed, even against all the nonsensical assertions of know-it-alls and other lunatics, who believe that higher life or any life at all would only exist on our Earth.
I have nothing else to say to that, for your remarks correspond to the reality. It would just be important to explain the actual original source of all life and all matter when it falls into your knowledge. It can indeed be assumed that you will also have this conversation transmitted later and will publish it for the instruction of the Earth humans.
I will, yes. Of course, I also know how life and matter actually originated. I just have to reach for the explanation in the spiritual teaching, aka creation energy teaching, which reveals what the four original substances, fire, air, water, and matter, originated from. In the first part of Genesis, sentences 123 to 131, the following is to be read. The idea of the creation was in becoming and being born, and the coagulation of the becoming visible space was seethed through by milky flakes, which grew as spiritual and material life into the creation and the universe. Life had become existent. The root remained, the light remained, the flakes remained, but the creation was one with everything in its division. From sentences 159 to 163, it is further explained as follows. Having recognized itself in its consciousness, the creation grasped the worth of its coming forth idea. Through the power of its thoughts, it created further. It created bodies and forms in multiplicity and variety, through which it animated the universe in diversity. And if I should now explain this in an interpretive way, which goes beyond the spiritual teaching, creation energy teaching into physics, and which should be understandable, then I must do this as follows. The creation flakes, or rather the flakes that were created by the creation and that formed in the empty space of the universe, were hydrogen formations, in which all the building blocks or 280 elements of life as well as all matter and gases, etc., which were already created by the creation, were existent. These hydrogen formations or hydrogen flakes combined themselves over the course of time into larger masses, and condensed themselves to such an extent that incredibly high temperatures arose within their interior and detonated the mass. These were, if I may say so, the first original supernova or original supernovas of the growing material universe belt. Even today, and throughout the entire future of the existence of the universe, the same still takes place. It is just that the form of the flakes has changed, because today, these are huge solar structures that explode out of themselves and eject from themselves all elements in the universe, through which life and the entire existence of all that exists is guaranteed in a constant growth and decay, as well as new emergence. Through the enormous explosions of the solar structures, which are often many times the size and mass of our sun, the building blocks of life, all necessary elements, are released and distributed throughout the universe. From this, new compounds, gases, neutrinos, and so on and so forth are created, which, in turn, form into structures, into galaxies, from which ultimately suns, planets, nebulae, and comets, etc. develop again. And through this, new life also develops again on suitable structures but this happens more in the outer regions of the galaxies. Like, for example, in our spiral galaxy, in which we exist with our solar system in the outer regions of a spiral arm, and to be sure, in the so-called Orion spiral arm.
Contact Report 248.
Do you also have any knowledge about when the first illnesses appeared on Earth, by which humans or pre-humans were attacked?
I can give very precise information about that, because according to our research, there were health illnesses and diseases on Earth approximately 4.5 million years ago.
There were already Earth-created humans?
There were only early forms of humans, upright walking, hominid tree dwellers, and ground inhabitants.
But still, clearly human life forms?
Certainly. But these beings were not yet filled with reason and understanding in the way that the actual first human was, who even disposed of cognitive reason and a recognizable consciousness. These beings arose on the earth at different times, so no single measure of time can be specified. The one namely developed authoritative and human-forming reason more than 3.7 million years ago, while others only became reason-bearing 2.5 million years ago, and others only 1.5 million years ago.
I have a knot in the hose somewhere. In the past, one told me, nevertheless, that humans had already been created on the Earth 6 to 12 million years ago. How does it happen that you speak of lower figures?
There must be a misunderstanding because the first human life forms emerged on the Earth 6 to 12 million years ago, which then developed over time into the human life form Homo sapiens. On the other hand, 5 to 6 million years ago, beings from other planets were also on the Earth occasionally, who also lived here for some time but later left the Earth again. Perhaps these beings are meant in your recollection, whose reason had already been given.
Perhaps I no longer remember this exactly. There was also once talk of human life forms that were created 6 to 8 million years ago, as well as those created 8 to 12 billion years ago.
I understand. You mix up the facts a bit, my friend. These human life forms that were created 8 to 12 billion years ago were not Earth humans, but rather people who stepped into appearance, respectively were created from beyond our galaxy, but whose distant descendants came to the Earth.
Contact Report 250.
On Earth, besides dinosaur traces, There are also human footprints that are millions of years old. These are both impressions that are still of normal size today, as it were, and those that are gigantic and thus originate from giants or giants, etc., and are much older in origin than the oldest traces of hominids found or their bone finds, which can only be traced back to about 4.5 million years, although Earth-born humanoids lived 9 to 12 million years ago. However, there are also ancient impressions and human footprints in small and large form next to dinosaur traces or elsewhere, which are between 65 and 140 million years old. How do you explain this when the first primeval human, hominid life forms on Earth lived at the earliest 9 to 12 million years ago? I really mean prehistoric man.
This is neither a secret nor a riddle, because all footprints of people of all sizes, from the dwarf-like beings to the giants, etc., are not traces of terrestrial human life forms. The impressions truthfully come from humans of planets not from Sul who visited Earth many millions of years ago or came here to live here. Many of them also died here, whereby petrified traces, footprints, and bones can still be found in many places on Earth today and bear witness to this fact. Earth humans only existed 9 to 12 million years ago.
Well, new finds of hominids, you told me a long time ago, are found in autumn 2000 in East Africa, in Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, or something like that. According to your words, the bones will then be estimated at about 5 to 6.5 million years. With the hominids, I mean of course only bones of these. But now the scientists still claim that the last member of the primeval hominids is the Lucy find, which proves that the Darwinian lie theory corresponds to the truth, namely that man is descended from apes. This, although it is known in initiated circles, which is stubbornly concealed, that Darwin, in order to prove his lie theory, filed and assembled monkey bones.
This actually corresponds to Darwin's work at that time. And of course, the scientific claim of today is erroneous and completely false that the findings of the remains of the hominid life form, Lucy, represent the link between ape and man, because in truth man did not descend from the ape, but the ape had the hominid human life form as its origin. This hominid human life form was an upright walker from early on, and thus a life form that walked on its two legs on the ground, but nevertheless also lived on trees for safety reasons, for which the feet and toes as well as the hands and fingers were shaped and formed accordingly. One could call these beings land tree humans.
Contact Report 251 Note: this contact report contains a detailed history related to the extraterrestrial humans who had a role in the history of humans on Earth, which is not reproduced here. Please click on the contact report link to view that lengthy section.
And here in the Sol system, far away from Sirius and the planets and intelligences there, the genetically manipulated ones have been eking out their existence ever since. Their descendants are testifying and are unstoppably evolving now as terrestrial humans, who will soon be able to open themselves, in order to penetrate into the vastness of the universe, where they originally came from. Quite contrary to the inadequate assertions of Earth, scientists that Earth man of today's form is a very own product of Earth, and even according to Charles Darwin's stupidly primitive false teaching comes from the monkey. Although purely Earth-created human beings live on Earth, on the one hand, they have their own evolutionary lineage independent of apes, while on the other hand, apes are descended from the first or early human beings. It will still take a number of years before Earth, humanity will find proof that its former ancestors from primordial times came from foreign solar and planetary systems to the SOL system and settled on Mars before they emigrated to Earth. It is also likely that the first evidence will then be found that the ancestors of the earliest times, the genetically manipulated and their descendants, were refugees and exiled who originally came from the Sirius regions. Earthmen was actually a single race in Enoch's primeval times, out of which further races formed through climatic changes, atmospheric changes, and secretions, resulting in new lines. These then intermingled with each other, creating new breeds again. Thus, in the course of time, both the skin colors of humans and their external appearance changed, always in adaptation to the new environment and the new living conditions, etc. Of course, this also resulted in genetic changes, apart from genetic manipulation. These, however, were not such that the origin and basic connection of the fact that all human beings on Earth originated from a single ancestral tribe would no longer be apparent. When, about 190,000 years ago, the people of the Lyra regions, etc., settled on Earth with the former immigrants and the former humans of the world, it would be impossible to see the origin and the basic connection between them. Their descendants joined again immediately, and when the peoples separated again in bigger thrusts and the most different areas of Earth were repopulated, new changes occurred in the skin color as well as in the external appearance and in the genes, whereby nevertheless also this time the original trunk was preserved, whereby still today it can be proven genetically that the terrestrial humans originated from a single primeval race.
Contact Report 258.
And what do you think about cloning in general? Is this to be prevented for the length of the future or not? Respectively, does it belong to the evolutionary path of mankind or not?
With regard to cloning itself, it must be said, just as in genetic science or genetic manipulation, that everything is inevitable in the long run because even the cloning of humans, animals, and plants belongs absolutely to the evolutionary process of man and cannot be prevented. Everything is only a question of time before this process openly begins, as is the case with genetic manipulation.
Contact Report 360.
And now that all monkey creatures carry within them some traditional factors of human character, since these creatures are descended from the original line of humans, it is not surprising that they are capable of killing, both in terms of their own genus and species, as well as in terms of other life forms. In this respect, monkeys are very strikingly similar to humans, which is not surprising, since these creatures originate from the human line. The fact that humans on the whole no longer behaves in the same way as the apes, and that he no longer kills in the same way as these, but has just become more human, with exceptions, is solely due to his conscious thinking, the development and use of his conscience and morality, and the perception of general responsibility. Excluded from this are only those human creatures that are still degenerate at the bottom of their character, that kill and torture without hesitation, etc., regardless of whether they are ordinary citizens or military personnel. And in this respect, I think that the rabbit is in the pepper. Namely, since ape creatures have more or less human factors in their behavior, and are incapable of distinguishing between good and evil, and between negative and positive, just as they have no trained conscience and know no conscious responsibility and evolution, they act only instinctively, uncontrollably and impulsively, etc. So they act in the same way as people did before they cultivated, before they evolved, and before they became aware of their conscience and responsibility. After all, apes and humans originally came from a primordial lineage from which the first primates emerged. While most ape creatures remained in their primacy, a few forms changed into actual hominids, from which the first earthly humans emerged. Therefore, a very strong distinction must be made between primates and hominids, because primates are and remain wild, instinct-driven, impulsive ape creatures, which are not capable of thought and feeling control, have no conscious conscience, and have no conscious responsibility. This is in complete contrast to humans, about half of whom have already evolved to such an extent that they are able to successfully resist all forms of degeneration. The other half still allows primate migration here and there, whereby a larger number is always ready to live out any kind of degeneration, including murder and other killing. That is how I see and understand everything.
What you say corresponds to reality. By paraphrasing this, you have also explained the fact that ape beings are not animals, but pure primates. Primates, however, are very different from animals, which do not contain any human factors.
Svath, Simyase, and Quetzal already said that. Monkeys are pure primates and should not be compared to animals or humans.
That is correct. The term primate was taken from the old Lyran term primaton, which means first being. Also, the term human, which means man, originates from the Old Lyrian language and was integrated into the earthly languages. It is completely wrongly handed down that the term should originate from early or late Latin, etc., because the true origin lies thousands of years ago, namely with the old Lyrian emigrants who left their home worlds for war reasons and settled on Earth for some time, only to emigrate again later. So when the late Latin explanation for primates is described as a member of an order of mammals or master animals comprising humans, apes, and prosimians, then this corresponds to an unforgivable falseness and falsification in terms of including humans. First of all, man is not a primate being that has only an instinctive consciousness, and not a consciously evolutionary consciousness, so that he cannot be called a primate being, and secondly, the term human clearly states that he is a human being with a conscious consciousness, so that conscious evolution is also given to him. And what still has to be explained in principle, in the origins of the development of primate beings, their form of consciousness was such that their consciousness was oriented towards a conscious evolutionary consciousness, as well as towards a form of instinct consciousness and impulse consciousness. Early on, however, a strong evolutionary separation took place, whereby only a single species retained its three forms of consciousness and made them evolutively into a single consciousness group, from which the species human or human being emerged. In contrast to this, the conscious evolutionary consciousness of all other primate beings degenerated, so that they fell into instinct consciousness alone and were no longer capable of conscious evolution, as has remained the case with the human being or human being. Thus, the ape beings are distant, degenerated descendants of the first beings, whose evolutionary line was determined by the conscious evolutionary consciousness to become a human being, and thus ultimately a human being. Through their degeneration of the forms of consciousness, however, the primates remained such and thus became the so-called monkeys, who only have an instinctive consciousness, which is, in a certain way, capable of learning instinctively and impulsively, as is also the case with many other beings who have an instinctive consciousness. And finally, it must be explained that on all worlds in the universe that bear higher and higher life, the evolutionary course to man or the incarnation through evolution is the same, and consequently primate beings or first beings arise everywhere, from which on the one hand the genus man develops through further evolution, while the remaining first beings fall victim to a degeneration of the form of consciousness, and thus remain primates or become ape beings, as they are called by the terrestrial human being.
Contact Report 367.
Darwin did indeed make the claim that in the animal kingdom, male life forms are polygamous, and female life forms are monogamous. Your father, Svath, already taught me in 1949 that this assertion was as misleading as that man was descended from apes, and Darwin, in order to substantiate this assertion, fraudulently filed down ape bones. As Svath said, in all fauna, all female forms are as polygamous as the male forms.
Contact Report 410.
The direct ancestors of the yellow races. As the races of China and Japan are called with you on Earth, came to Earth 25,994 years ago, counted from today on, and settled in the areas of today's China and Japan. Their very distant ancestors were at very early times or millions of years, like the white, red, and brown races, partly refugees from the Sirius areas, which were shifted to the Dern spacetime structure. The yellow races first settled in distant regions beyond the Sun or central Sun, where they founded large races in the Nisan system on a planet called Kudra, and created a huge overpopulation. As a result, in addition to the fact that the planet was slowly becoming uninhabitable, a great emigration took place about 2.4 million years ago, with large masses migrating and settling in the Lyra systems on this side of the central Sun on a neighboring planet of Lasan. Their planet was called Nisan. These systems and planets in the Lyra regions were also offset to our space-time structure by fractions of a second or seconds, whereas the Nisan system and its planets, thus also Kudra, beyond the galaxy belong to the Dern space-time structure. Now it must still be said that about 2.4 million years ago, when the emigrants separated from Kudra and moved to the Lyra regions, a certain part also came to Earth and settled already in the areas of today's China and Japan, where also already Earth-born human beings existed. The early emigrants from the Kudra peoples who settled on Earth were left to their fate without any technical achievements, because the transport ship that should have brought the technical materials never arrived on Earth, but remained lost. Thus, the immigrants were also deprived of the technology that would have enabled them to contact the emigrants in the Lyra systems. This resulted in them being forgotten. 25,994 years ago, Nisan was once again overpopulated, and larger groups of emigrants were formed to investigate other emigrants in the past. So they also came across the Earth and the areas of today's China and Japan, which resulted in migrations to these areas on the Earth and the resettlement of today's China and Japan, including the merging with the very distant descendants of the former emigrants and with the Earth-born.
Contact Report 437. Your line of primates, becoming of human and ape.
Originally, the ape creatures and the human being descended from a single line, which formed as a physically wavering form, that is to say, as a constitution, that is to say, as a primary state, and was animated by an impulse energy spirit form, as the plants have. This impulse energy spirit form that is to say, was firstly given as an line of the primates arising from it, because in these physically wavering wesen, that is to say, in these initial wesen, which was neither animal, other creature nor human, but rather just a kind of slimy, wavering plant-like mass, still no instinct-based or consciousness-based evolving spirit form could incarnate, that is to say, bear into. It was only when this kind of V-sin was far and highly enough developed to a primate, so that it possessed an actual brain, it became capable of receiving an combination of a conscious evolution consciousness and an instinct consciousness in the now developed brain. This combination of evolution consciousness and instinct consciousness was related to, evolvingly resulting from the form of the impulse consciousness, a hybrid spirit form, out of which two new spirit forms and thus two new lines and developments emerged, namely a hominid one, out of which through the overall consciousness block a conscious consciousness originated, and thus the conscious evolution-capable consciousness of the human being, nevertheless retaining to a certain extent the forms of the instinct consciousness and the impulse consciousness. With regard to the other spirit form, this formed itself as a pure instinct spirit form with an unconscious and therefore not consciously evolution-capable instinct consciousness, precisely that of the apes, in which a part of the impulse consciousness was also retained. And when it is now taught, originally the apes and the human beings indeed descended from one line, out of which emerged the primates. In the origins of the development of the primates' V-sin, these were, in their form of consciousness, formed as such that their consciousness was directed both to a conscious evolution consciousness, as well as a form of instinct consciousness and an impulse consciousness. Early on, however, a strong evolutionary separation took place, though which only one kind retained its three consciousness forms, and made these evolutively into a single consciousness compound, from which the species human, that is to say, human being, originated. And finally, there is still to explain that on all the worlds in the universe which bear higher and high life, the evolutionary course to the human being, that is to say, the becoming human through the evolution, is in the same wise. Consequently, everywhere primate Wesen, that is to say, initial V-sin originate, from which on the one hand the human species develops in a further evolution, while the remaining initial V-sin fell into a degeneration of the form of consciousness, and thus remained primates, that is to say, become apes, as they are called by human beings of Earth. Then that is to be understood as follows. The spirit form of the human being after the developmental change from an Erline is in a state of the primate V-sin, and so in its initial body-related origin, a form which can develop itself both positively as also negatively. If that is said as an allegory with regard to the unconscious instinct consciousness of the ape creatures, of the animals, and the other creatures in the sense of the negative as well as in the sense of the positive, with regard to the conscious and consciously evolutive consciousness of the human being. Fundamentally, it is given with the first becoming of each spirit form, that it comes forth out of an evolutive developmental change of an unconscious impulse consciousness, that is to say, from an impulse spirit form, that is capable to developmentally change to the higher, and develops itself in the hybrid stage only to the actual conscious human or unconscious animalistic spirit form, just as that is the allegory for the material life forms, which in the first stages during the conception, that is to say, procreation and becoming, show a neutral form and develop themselves only through the further development to the positive, that is to say, male, as well as to the negative, that is to say, female. I have here yet another question, because someone has asked me for an answer in the bulletin regarding on what Charles Darwin, in 1859, has constructed his theory of evolution, that the human being would be descended from apes. I learned from your father, Svath, that Darwin falsified an ape skeleton in order to prove his theory, whereby, however, his assertion, being that the human descended from apes, did not even grow out of his own rubbish. In reality, as Svath explained, Charles Darwin was linked with Tibetan Buddhists, who told him of the Tibetan legend, according to which all human beings would descend from 8 different branches of apes. Can I convey my answer in this way?
Of course, because what my father explained to you corresponds to the truth. Darwin was a human who craved renown and did everything illicitly and dishonestly to greatly build up his image. The Darwinian teaching of evolution in regard to the Earth humans, that they originally arose from the apes, is truly not based on his own thought processes or from his own research, rather on a Tibetan legend that all humans descended from 8 different branches of apes. Darwin put the legend to use, whereby he suitably filed certain bones of an ape skeleton in order to substantiate and provide a line of evidence for his deceit, and presented the whole thing to the scientific body of the day.
Darwin, as founder of the so-called modern theory of evolution, actually did study medicine and then later theology, whereby he came into contact with Buddhists from Tibet. Indeed, he was generally dealt with as a naturalist, but that role started as he took part in the world voyage of the survey ship Beagle, which was underway on the world's seas from 1831 until 1836. From 1842, as I have read, he began to work on his comprehensive travel experiences, and systematically collected his extensive material together in regard to the origin of the species. Geological observations, as well as those of fauna as it pertains to geography, caused him to doubt the rightness of the traditional teaching of the inalterability of the species. From that also arose his main work, The Origin of the Species Through Natural Selection, which constituted a turning point in the history of biology in 1859. With the theory of selection, which led to Darwinism, respectively to the Darwinian teachings of descent, he explained the purposive adaptation of forms of life to the environment. That he thereby also tried to underpin his teachings through the fraud of his adaptation of ape bones, and that he presented the Tibetan legend that all humans are arisen from 8 branches of apes as reality, then led to the erroneous teaching that the human descended from apes, whereby this has endured until today, and even the scientists grant their belief to this deception. In 1871, he then published 2 volumes entitled The Descent of Man. Darwin was born on February 12, 1809 in the Mount at Shrewsbury in England, and he died on April 19, 1882 in Down House, which corresponds to today's London Bromley. Are these statements true so far?
All of it corresponds to the rightness. Yes, those are the actual facts.
Contact Report 453.
You once told me that life on Earth did not originate in water, but in the sands of the shores, so life on Earth evolved or emerged in that way. But it was first brought here from outer space. With regard to thermobacteria, etc., this had already happened millions of years ago, when the Earth was still a ball of embers, but the last 500 million years in particular had been the most decisive with regard to all kinds of great and largest life forms that developed on the Earth. And after that, the last 70 million years in particular were of great importance, during which many comets and meteors and large amounts of space dust, ice, and water fell to Earth, bringing with them much bacterial life and amino acids, from which more and more diverse life developed. This is clear to me as far as it goes, but I'm interested in what the actual origin of this life was. It would have to have been the chemistry and physical processes of the universe, I think.
Your assumption is correct. The origin and existence of all life owes this to the basic laws of universal chemistry and physics, from which left-turning amino acids developed fundamentally for the emergence of life itself, which formed and also continue to form the main factor of the biological emergence of life as a whole in universal breadth. From this it also emerges that every form of life is planetary, chemically, physically conditioned. Consequently, this is also different from planet to planet and has innumerable forms universe-wide and is not necessarily human-like, as you know and as you were able to see for yourself together with us on your great journey through large parts of the universe on the most diverse worlds.
Yes, I never forget that. All the different life forms, which also included various intelligent ones that were not human-like. I would like to say, however, that despite the very great strangeness, they cannot be called monsters, just as they cannot be called human-like life forms. Some have also developed higher and higher cultures and techniques, which may seem futuristic and fantastic to Earthlings, but nevertheless corresponds to the truth. Many of the alien life forms, however, were of the animal kind, and you let me look at a great many bacterial forms under a device that I would like to call a microscope for the sake of simplicity, because it had such a function, but has no resemblance to the devices we know. It was interesting for me to be able to determine that human life is extremely thinly spread throughout the universe, and that most life-bearing worlds carry life forms that look completely futuristic to Earthlings. And I remember you explaining that human life forms found their widespread expansion in the universe on various occasions, only because they created the technical means to be able to emigrate to other worlds through space travel. I also still hear your words today when you said that life forms existed on practically all planets, comets, meteors, and celestial bodies, as well as in the nebulae and gases in the universe, even if, as a rule, they were only bacterial life forms, except on planets? And as you have let me see, such life forms also exist on the moons of our Sol satellites, as well as on these themselves.
Contact Report 459.
Charles Robert Darwin, the British, actually studied medicine and then theology, and only later became a natural scientist. It is said that he suffered from an unknown disease for many years of his life. Do you know anything about it? I was asked about it, but I could not give any information about it.
Yes, I can tell you something about that. Because my father, Svath, he was not in contact with Darwin, made a close observation with regard to Darwin, and recorded everything in an extensive work which I studied. From my father's records, it is clear that Darwin suffered from anxiety psychosis and was a severe hypochondriac who imagined many ailments, but suffered from a serious infectious disease in addition to that, which caused him great distress. He became infected with the disease germs in Latin America through so-called Benchuca bugs. The bite of these blood-sucking bugs causes an infection, which leads to the so-called Chagas disease, which first develops in the stomach and heart. The disease itself is not contagious and still exists today, although it can be transmitted by blood transfusions, which is a cause for concern today, because blood donations contaminated by Chagas disease are spreading more and more in Latin America and are moving northwards, so it is already slowly spreading in the USA.
Contact Report 467.
Yes, all life developed from a single-celled primeval slime, also humans. However, as I know from Svath, there were different forms of primeval slime, from which in turn different animal life developed, such as amphibians, water life forms, and various species of dinosaurs. From a separate primeval slime form, however, the first small creatures developed, which were mammals, from which all mammals developed, so also primates and humans. These all have a uniform type of mating, but also uniform hearing organs, of course, depending on the life form, simply shaped differently according to it, but in principle in the same application and mode of action. As your father, Svath, explained to me in my youth, the first small forms of life that developed from the primeval slime, from which humans also emerged on Earth, lived more than 250 million years ago, and also at the time when the first dinosaurs existed. These small life forms were about 10 to 12 centimeters in size, about the size of a mouse, but they changed and grew a few centimeters larger. Their lifetime was just 1 year, but with time their age increased, the bigger they became. The transformation over millions of years led to different life forms, but only to mammals, and finally to many species of primates, and to forms from which humans emerged, and from which also the different apes and those creatures that have not been found yet, like the Yeti, which is called Mahalidama by the locals and Mandibarung elsewhere. Also Bigfoot and Sasquatch, etc. belong to it. Now, to cut a long story short, what is the name of the little animal that is the origin of all mammals, primates, and humans?
Our name of the small creature is Barani, but the little animal is now also known to earthly paleontologists through findings of fossilized bones, and they call it Adelobasileus, Adelobasileus cromptoni.
Contact Report 469.
But tell me, how many species of life forms do you know, which have developed so far in their intelligence, that they can think consciously and also carry out conscious actions and also create technical achievements, etc., as well as build up their own cultures, and which are classified in a revolution of consciousness?
We know of 14 different species of life forms as they correspond to your question and which I can tell you. Then I would like to give you information whereby I name the individual life forms according to how it makes sense to Earth humans and how they also understand it. Thus I will begin with us actual humanoids, whereby I must explain that all life form species, which I have to call, show human or human-like forms in shape, as well as forms mixed with their other species, whereby the only human-like beings are not actual humanoids, but just different and embodying two different species. All of them, however, are capable of a conscious development of consciousness, have their own cultures and languages as well as techniques, whereby some of the ones we know are also masters of space travel and belong to our Federation. All of them, at least those who belong to our Federation, are peaceful beings and have no warlike or violent ambitions. Humanoids are human beings in the form in which we play Aran, and the Earth humans, as well as many of us, are allies of our Federation, to which, however, other life forms also belong, which cannot be called humanoids in our sense, because they are of a completely different kind, but nevertheless consciously capable of evolution and have developed their own cultures and techniques as well as languages, as I already explained. 2. Amphiboids are, in terms of form, life forms of mixed human and aquatic animal nature, which can live both in water and on land, as well as in a climate that is heavily water-filled. Asina, Image 1, Image 2, for example, and her people are among them. Note, see Contact Reports 90, 91, and 93 for information on Billy's first encounter with Asina. 3. Reptiloids are life forms of mixed human and reptilian form, their bodies being covered with scales. 4. Insectoids are life forms of mixed human and insect-like form, their skin showing chitin-like characteristics. 5. Sauroids are life forms of mixed human and sauropod-like form with a skin similar to elephant skin. 6. Primatoids are life forms of mixed human and primate-like form with a hairy body, but in a stronger form than the terrestrial humanoid or Earth humans. 7. Condycoids are in form of life forms actual humanoids, but with the ability to move by levitation. 8. Pteropoids are life forms with human and bird-like body, with long neck, face, and beak-like mouth. 9. Hydroids are life forms with human and fish-like bodies, whose actual life element is water, which they can also leave for a longer period of time. 10. Thermoids are in shape humanoid life forms with a human-like body, whose own life element is hot areas with very high temperature. 11. Frigoroids are in form humanoid life forms with human bodies, whose life elements are very cold areas with very low temperatures below zero. 12. Areoids are in form humanoid life forms with human body, whereby they are poison gas breathers and their life element are various gas atmospheres. 13. Acaroids are in form humanoid life forms with a human body, but their skin is covered by a fine layer of acid, like for example the trilans. 14. Fluoroids are life forms with human-like and diverse plant bodies. 15. Centauroids are life forms with partly human and partly equine bodies. 16. Faunoids are life forms with partly human and partly various ungulate bodies. 17. Cheruboids are in shape and weight very light human life forms, equipped with feathered wings through which they can fly. 18. Seraphoids are life forms very light in shape and weight, partly human and partly animal, equipped with feathered wings through which they can fly. These are the people we know of various genera and species, that is to say, races of human and human animal-like life forms, which I name in the above-mentioned way, so that Earth humans can also get an idea of them. Our names are, of course, of a different kind, but they correspond to the value of the names mentioned. Basically, however, it is to be said that all the life forms mentioned, which are the same as human beings, are also beings who in their whole, or in part, resemble our human forms, to which they have changed over millions of years. Apart from this, however, their appearance in terms of the appearance of their skin and its excrescences is different from that of us who call ourselves pure humanoids. But since several of the life forms I have mentioned are probably humanoid in appearance, but different in the outer appearance of their skin and its outgrowths, we call them peregrine humanoids, as has been explained to you earlier. This term means as much as foreign humanoids. All mentioned life forms are therefore in their essence humanoids, which also have a humanoid spirit form and are part of a conscious evolution of consciousness. The origin of the peregrine humanoids is not the same as with us pure humanoids, but their development into peregrine humanoids has taken place in a similar way as with the pure humanoids. Their primeval forms were very small and only gradually developed into larger life forms, which in turn were subject to multiple changes until they became the beings they are today. Such a course of evolutionary form has also taken place in relation to us purely humanoids, because our course of evolution has also brought about various changes until finally the purely humanoid human being was created.
Then another question regarding Neanderthals, of whom more and more bones have been found in recent years and decades. Yes, it is generally said that they disappeared on Earth when the so-called modern human beings, Homo sapiens, appeared. So far, however, it is completely unknown why the Neanderthals disappeared from the scene. It is also not known whether they at least partially mixed with modern human beings. Do you know anything about that?
It was indeed the case that in the most various locations, the modern human beings interbred with Neanderthals and begot offspring. This, however, was not the rule, but occurred rather sparsely. As a rule, the modern human beings hunted the Neanderthals and killed them to use them as food, because the early Homo sapiens were cannibals, and as such they by and by wiped out the Neanderthals. Partly, the modern human beings held Neanderthals as captives, which they killed and ate in case of need for food. Such captives were also used, on certain occasions, to perform sexual acts with the Homo sapiens, and indeed with both sexes. As a result, also certain female Neanderthals and Homo sapiens bore hybrids as offspring, which, however, was not often the case.
Contact Report 476.
Yes. Now on the 12th of February, we will celebrate the memory of Charles Robert Darwin, who was born on the 12th of February 1809, and who, as the founder of the modern theory of evolution, made a worldwide fuss about it. Although he initially studied medicine, he later studied theology, which then contradicted his theory of evolution, which was of correctness in principle, yes. Yes, in order to prove his theory, he committed a falsification and deception by filing down monkey bones. But his theory of evolution was indeed not only a theory, but a teaching that was and is true. Thus he explained that human beings and animals were not created by a god in one day, but that they came into being and developed over millions of years through a natural process of development and natural selection, which is also true. Nevertheless, there are still very many people who, in their religiosity or in their sectarianism, still reject the theory of evolution, and in their delusion of faith cling to the fairy tale that human beings and animals were created in a single day by a God creator.
Contact Report 534.
Scientists generally claim that the human being has its origin in Africa. But your father Svath told me something else, namely, that the real origin is in the north of Africa. He also took me to a place in Germany, whose name I have forgotten, where he dug up a fossil and explained to me the pre-human fossils, respectively, the pre-human characteristics, and also said that it was the actual forerunner of the human being, which had started to develop 48 million years ago. Svath showed me on the fossil that the creature already had 5 fingers, respectively thumbs and fingers, and also 5 toes and a set of teeth, which were very similar to those of the human being of today. Through his apparatus, Svath was also able to make the creature holographically visible to me, so that I could see it in its full size of about 60 cm and in its real form. I think that what Svath said is more likely to be true than the claims of the earthly scientists.
What my father explained is correct. The real origin of development of Earth humans was not in the south of the Earth, but in the north of Africa. This development began 48 million years ago, when the early beings split up into precursors of the human being and apes. Just as the ape creatures lived on trees at that time and still do so today, so did the early beings from which human beings ultimately evolved live on trees at that time and until a few million years ago. And the very well-preserved fossil that my father uncovered in an open-cast mine in the so-called Messel Pit in Hesse is around 47 million years old. It has been in our possession ever since, and it is clear from it that the primordial beginning of the formation of the early life form, from which Earth humans ultimately emerged, was not in the African South, but in the north of Africa. What my father has explained to you is correct, which is also proven by our research, even before his statement, which took us back to the time when the division of the early beings 48 million years ago into a form of human and an ape-like line took place.
Svath said that due to climate, land and continental changes, the early beings spread from the north of Africa far over the earth, also to the African south, east, and west, where the first different primeval human species developed about 8 to 12 million years ago.
This occurred in the north of Africa, where today are Egypt, Malta, and Sicily, because that is where the area of today's Messel Pit in Germany was located at that time. This was the actual origin of the early beings from which the primeval human form as mammals developed.
Unfortunately, no fossils have yet been found in this respect. I mean in relation to life forms that would already be human, or at least human-like. However, it is likely that there are such fossils that just need to be found.
That is undeniable.
Contact Report 544.
Then I have a question that refers to the Neanderthals, or rather to their extinction. Again and again there are reports about it on television and in newspapers and magazines, whereby the scientists, however, to this day still do not know the real reason for their extinction. There are the most diverse gray theories about this, including one that says that the Neanderthals were exterminated by Homo sapiens, the emerging human being at the time, as you yourself once said. But is that really true down to the last detail? Additionally, I now want to ask you whether that which you have explained is comprehensive in relation to the extinction of the Neanderthals, or whether there were yet other factors which played a role. You did indeed once say later that the extinction of these early human beings led back not only to the then emergence of modern human beings, even though they exterminated different groups of Neanderthals. By the way, today the term Neanderthal is also written with a th, thus Neanderthals. I also don't know why. But if you could now explain to me across the board some more about these early human beings and their environment, etc., as well as whether there were perhaps other reasons for their extinction besides the ones you have mentioned to me. Because for our scientists, it is still not clear what the real reason for the extinction had been, so their minds are divided. Maybe you are able to bring a little more clarity to the matter?
That which I have said to you with my explanation in the 469th contact conversation corresponds very well to the rightness. But if you are raising the whole thing in such a way as to ask whether thereby everything has been comprehensively explained down to the last detail, then it must be said that this is not the case. In fact, the modern human beings who emerged then exterminated entire groups and tribes of Neanderthals. But for their final extinction, there were also given anatomical as well as natural climate-changing influences, which I have hitherto never mentioned, and which ultimately ended the existence of these early human beings. Apart from the fact that the modern human beings came to Europe from Western Asia, who often ate human flesh and were anatomically much more developed than the Neanderthals, whom they hunted down, killed, and used them as food, there are, as I said, other important factors that led to the extinction of these early human beings. But if I am now supposed to mention other important factors, then I will gladly do so, and in doing so I will draw on our records, which we possess and which I am familiar with. Thereby, I will not proceed chronologically, however, rather simply as I remember the facts at the moment. So the first thing to say is that which I explained regarding modern human beings' cannibalism and in relation to the sexual acts between them and the Neanderthals, in fact, corresponds to the reality of that time. Although, against all adversity at the time, the Neanderthals held their own for a little more than 250,000 years, but in the development of their body and metabolism, they were adjusted to the then prevailing very cold climate. That finally led to their last doom because when in a short time extremely strong climatic changes occurred, the effect for the Neanderthals was an extremely disadvantageous impact on their food supply. Consequently, many began to suffer from hunger. Over time, this led not only to degenerative effects but also often to the death. In spite of their savagery, they were sociable beings and held tightly together, whereby they lived, however, only in small groups, and their total number always remained small. When diseases arose among them, they concerned themselves collectively with the sick and nursed them. Their diet consisted primarily of meat, which they captured by corresponding hunts for all kinds of small and large animals, whereby they then shared the meat among themselves in a remarkably communal way. However, they also nourished themselves with berries, fruits, and plants, but the meat always remained the staple food, which was of great necessity for especially their entire constitution. Fundamentally, however, they were bad at metabolizing food, on which I will be speaking again. Physically, they were very strong, and also all their internal and external constitution was extremely robust and adjusted in such a way to withstand very cold temperatures, which was particularly important because they indeed lived during a very cold time. They were also clever and had their own, if still primitive, language. They led their existence in productive hunting areas in the then forests in which they also lived and knew safe shelters, in whose protection they also had their accommodations. However, all this changed unusually quickly, as around 45,000 years ago the climate began to change drastically. In addition to the fact that the modern human beings made their appearance and hunted them down, kept them prisoners, engaged in sexual relations with them, but also killed and ate them when food was in short supply. The emerging climate change gradually also altered the forests and landscapes. Consequently, gigantic open expanses emerged in which the Neanderthals could not hold their own, and, as a consequence of their cumbersomeness, also could not hunt. Their specialty was the forests, where they could stalk the game to be hunted and kill it with primitive, heavy spears equipped with stone points that had been beaten into shape. These heavy killing instruments and the ponderousness and clumsiness of the Neanderthals made it impossible for them to hold their own in the vastness of open plains. Moreover, they could not stalk the wildlife on open land because it fled quickly if it sighted or caught the scent of the human beings. So the Neanderthals hid in the forests, which had now become lighter, but where they also had more and more difficulties in terms of hunting, because they no longer had any cover due to the lightening of the forest areas when stalking the animals. Furthermore, it was the case that the Neanderthals could not sufficiently utilize the nutrients from meat, plants, berries, and fruits, and could not efficiently convert them into energy. Consequently, they had to constantly eat large quantities. The cells and their energies and powers of the early human beings were of a completely different nature than those of the much lighter and more flexibly built modern human beings. With the Neanderthals, the entire metabolism was laid out to the production of heat, which was absolutely necessary as a consequence of the then prevailing cold. This was completely different from the modern human beings who had emerged and were downright puny compared to the Neanderthals and displayed totally different characteristics to the heavily built early human beings. And since the Neanderthals increasingly lacked food, it naturally led to many dying of hunger, while others were hunted and captured by the cannibalistic modern human beings to use them as welcome sex objects or, in an emergency, as food. Since through the sexual acts between the Neanderthals and the modern human beings, offspring were also conceived, it turned out that the offspring increasingly had the characteristics of modern human beings. Hence, this is another factor of what led to the extinction and extermination of the pure Neanderthals. And since the evolution never stands still, it turned out that the modern human beings also evolved further, up to the present Homo sapiens sapiens, whereby the heritage of the Neanderthals has been preserved in the genome of many terrestrial human beings to this day. Although the Neanderthals became extinct almost 30,000 years ago, however, their genetic heritage remains intact until today and will also be passed on from generation to generation in the future. Regarding the descendants of Neanderthals directly, as well as those where modern humans were involved, it has nevertheless to be explained that also in this respect, factors of extinction played a role. Compared to the modern human beings, the Neanderthals featured larger skulls, which made the birth very difficult because the birth canal often could not be dilated far enough, which is why many female beings died during births or through severe life-threatening infections. Births among the Neanderthals were therefore particularly complicated and difficult and often fatal, which was also the reason why these early human beings did not proliferate extensively and only appeared in small groups. Alongside the genetic material of the Neanderthals, however, also traces of the genetic material of other close relatives have found their way into today's Earth humans living in Europe. Although there are no longer any pure Neanderthals among the approximately 8,000 million Earth humans today, their heritage is still to a greater of lesser extent contained in the genome of many Earth humans. And it is a fact, as you say, that there are many theories among earthly scientists regarding the Neanderthals, who today no longer exist in pure form for already some 30,000 years. But since their heritage is still present in small parts, namely up to 7%, in the genome of many Earth humans today, one really has to ask whether the Neanderthals have actually become extinct, because if certain Earth humans of the present time are looked at, then one could actually assume that the Neanderthals are not yet extinct. This fact alone, of the Neanderthal heritage in the genome of many modern Earth humans, proves that these early human beings had sexual relationships with the modern human beings, from which descendants have emerged who have continued to reproduce and pass on their heritage over many generations until the present time.
Contact Report 650.
First, the number of 144,000 people corresponds to a very early norm of an emigration power created by Nacademion, which was usually led by 228 commanders, although there were seldom small exceptions, who, together with the emigration power, were under the command of an emigration Swiss. Such emigration powers were volunteers who idealistically agreed to spend the rest of their lives with early humans on other worlds, as well as on Earth, in order to teach them many helpful things about life management and development. For the first time, such an emigration force was sent out millions of years ago, followed by several more in 4 galaxies over all times, and thus also into the SOL system and finally to Earth. The last one to Earth was sent according to earthly time calculation about 13,500 years ago, where the Nacademian people emigrants on the one hand were to have an instructive effect on Earth humans, which they partly did, but on the other hand caused for the most part many calamities, especially with regard to rising up as deities and bringing religions into being. and they did so when they were smuggled into all earthly peoples and great tribal communities, whereby delusional beliefs in God developed among all peoples, tribes, and groups, etc., throughout the world, even among wild indigenous tribes. This led to the emergence of religions and sects, which expanded more and have survived to the present day and into the third millennium, respectively, and will continue to do so for a very long time to come. All those of these extraterrestrial immigrants who remained on Earth also died there, and since then their spiritual forms have also reincarnated and will continue to reincarnate on Earth, precisely in ever new personalities of newly born Earth humans. So the 144,000 emigrants and their superiors and leaders were integrated worldwide as instructors into all existing earthly peoples and large tribes, as well as various groups in which they had to act as instructors. Our annals refer to a number of 8 different emigration powers of 144,000 persons each and 228 superiors each, who came to Earth in the course of more than 2 million years from the Nocademian descendant peoples. And here is a total number of 1,051,928 people who were involved. Of these persons, 575,914 remained on Earth, died there, and are born again with their old reincarnating spirit forms as new personalities.
Can I understand it? But how did it happen that 144,000 each agreed to give up their highly developed culture and live on Earth with early humans like Homo erectus?
On the one hand, they were pronounced idealists who were willing to provide development aid, so to speak, as is similarly the case on Earth, where such aid is provided for third world countries, etc. On the other hand, they were also very active in the field of development aid.
Then it kind of rubbed off on Earth humans.
One can say so, but on the other hand, there were also genetically manipulated refugees from the serious regions among the immigrants from the Nocademian post-driving peoples, as well as the mistakes and the mistakes. Criminals of the home planets who preferred, instead of being sent into exile, which was extremely drastically and strictly handled, to emigrate with such emigration powers and to be freely instructive to early humans in the manufacture of various products, such as tools and hunting weapons, clothing and food containers, etc. Primitive art, music, and all kinds of knowledge were also taught to early man by these immigrants, as well as knowledge concerning the heavenly bodies, medicine concerning medicinal plants, etc., and the use of fire, etc.
And how and where were the distributions of these immigrant persons made among the early earthly human beings?
Small immigrant groups were formed, which were integrated into earthly early human groups all over the world, while others joined early humans as loners or lived as their own small groups, which then also mixed with the early humans over time. In these forms, it was possible that mergers with the immigrants and the early humans could come about, which was, however, not always simple, but often connected with fights, which also claimed deaths on both sides. But in the end, everything regulated itself in one way or another, so that the teachings could also take place and bear fruit.
So the whole thing was not easy, but therefore the actual creators of all progressive inventions of the early humans were to be led back to the immigrants of the Nocademian descendants peoples. And this was the only reason why the humanity of today, which emerged from the early humans, could develop so drastically fast and as far as is the case today, with regard to electronics, inventions, craftsmanship, art, medicine, music and technology, etc., and so on. In principle, it would not have been possible without the direct immigrants from the Nocademian peoples, and without their distant descendants and all their teachings, as well as also without your apparatus impulse hypnotic influence of the descendants of the extraterrestrial immigrants, that earthly mankind could develop so rapidly, and to a large extent up to the today's conditions.
During the first millions of years and millennia, this was indeed the case. Of course, only in primitive developments of various things, for everything always had to be adapted to the corresponding state of consciousness of Earth humanity. This is because it was only possible to avoid an overdevelopment in every respect, because such an overdevelopment could not have been coped with by the Earth humans in terms of understanding and reason. The early extraterrestrial immigrants naturally had to withhold their knowledge as well as their abilities and possibilities in every imaginable form, and to downgrade themselves in this respect in order not to overtax the early earthly humans, who became known as Homo erectus through research in modern times, and also later the more highly developed earthly humans with excessive abilities, on the one hand, and on the other hand, in order to adapt to them in every necessary way. However, the early Earth humans were very instructive, as are to some extent the Earth humans of today, but unfortunately not with regard to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and quickly learned the simple things, followed by a relatively fast development, and continued to do so. As a result, they also created advances, inventions, knowledge and developments, which have continued to behave in this way in all the long periods of time since then, and have carried us into the future, even to the point of Homo sapiens, and also into the present time of Homo sapiens sapiens. So, in later times, the Earth humans who developed from it came from the Homo erectus, whereby, however, also various intermediate kinds developed from it, namely in the today's Asia areas as well as in Africa, whereby a very important basic origin was given in Europe, namely in the today's Germany, where a basic life form developed, from which in the end a human life form developed, which developed then, however, in the southern hemisphere completely. In the first beginnings, early humans were used as sexual partners by the first Nocodemion descendants, immigrants of peoples, so one has to say, whereby over a large number of generations, several new human species arose, which are called Nephotwesen or Mischwesen in our annals. From these, a new human species emerged, which is also known to earthly scientists as Denisova man, and which was an important factor in the further development of mankind on Earth, together with the Neanderthals and so on.
Well, then the question. The emigration troops have paired with the early Earthlings. Did modern people ultimately emerge from this? At that time, I think there was only Homo erectus. But then came the Denisova people, who our scientists already know, as you say.
This is not quite true, because the scientists are still in the process of clarifying and speculating and do not have any real knowledge in this respect. All they've got is some small fossils to speculate on.
You mean that they make hypotheses or simply assumptions and assumptions, because they have no actual proof of what, where, and from what kind of people the fossils originate?
Yes, it is.
Homo erectus was probably a clever fellow when I rhymed everything you said. Can you say something about that?
Homo erectus means the upright walking man. Basically, he was the first true Earth man who was a direct ancestor of the Neanderthals, and thus also the primeval ancestor of the actual Earth human of today. Homo erectus was, contrary to the false assertions of earthly researchers and scientists, about 2.7 million years ago, the successor of those first human beings who emerged from the first hominid primate-like beings, but who were not primates from the ground up, but first hominid beings, only that these looked wild and primate-like in their outward appearance, but had no reason whatever with primates. According to our research, the first of these species existed on Earth around 12 million years ago. Homo erectus emerged 2.7 million years ago from natural earthly hominid development, and it was also effectively the most successful hominid Earth ever produced. The first emigrating power and extraterrestrial visitors, who had already immigrated to Earth at that time, mixed early with the Homo erectus, who were still very wild but nevertheless peaceful, pure Earth creatures. From this, a small new species developed from the genus Homo erectus, which was then also of very long existence, increased further, and from which also still another new species developed. Most of the extraterrestrial visitors, however, left Earth and did not return. After that, about 1 million years ago and also afterwards, 4 more emigration powers came to Earth, of which a small number remained, while the majority left again. Then, 389,000 years ago, the 144,000 more immigrants of the distant descendants of the Nocodemion descendants, who also mixed worldwide, like all other immigrants, with pure terrestrial human beings, came, as you mentioned, 144,000 more immigrants. From all these, and in mixture with other hominid forms of development, Earthman Homo sapiens sapiens, living today, emerged in the end since primeval times, actually as a very far-developed Homo erectus, who is to be called the actual direct primeval ancestor of Earthman. Furthermore, it is a fact that, with respect to Homo erectus, this was not a hairy early man monstrosity that simply ran wildly swinging a club around and knocked down anything that got in his way. The Homo erectus did not just growl and make any dull noises either, because in fact it was already able to articulate itself understandably. So the early ancestor of the terrestrial man was different in this respect from the false views of terrestrial researchers. Homo erectus already had a lot of abilities very early on through the teachings of the extraterrestrial visitors, e.g., with regard to the production and use of fire. He was also not simply a cave dweller, even if there were such exceptions, because he effectively built huts for his own use, made hunting weapons and tools, partly cooked his food and built boats for water, etc., all through the teachings of the extraterrestrial immigrants. And these abilities, along with many others, which Homo erectus had learned through the immigrants, he also passed on to his descendants, whereby these values have been preserved up to the present time in the terrestrial human being, and have, moreover, been extraordinarily extended in terms of development. Already at the first time of its existence, Homo erectus was very adaptable and comparatively peaceful, which has been preserved to this day in those terrestrial humans who are not affected by the hereditary gene manipulation of the X chromosome caused by the Syrians.
Thank you. Then we will finally have clarity in this respect as to how everything has happened. This also refutes the weak-headed assertion of those lunatics who swear that humanity on Earth was created by extraterrestrials, such as the Raelian sect and other sects spread this nonsense.
Extraterrestrials have in very early and also in more recent times only interfered in the development of the ancient terrestrial early human beings, which is why they have played certain determining roles in this respect and have also brought calamity to the Earth. This, too, in the wise of their mating and mixing with the terrestrial early humans beings, and so bringing the Syrian genetic manipulation to the Earth. The latter has then spread on a large scale among the earthly humankind by way of heredity, and has through aggression, disharmony, jealousy, wars, murders, manslaughter, unpeace, and unfreedom, etc., brought a great deal of calamity and has preserved it up to the present time. But so this did not happen as a result of a creation of Earth humans by extraterrestrials and alleged Elohim, etc., by extraterrestrial immigrants, who mated and mixed with the early herd people, On the one hand, only the Syrian gene manipulation and other gene transfers caused by race were spread worldwide by inheritance. And on the other hand, already early, the generally all-encompassing and at that time possible primitive development was promoted in various relations. Only in these forms did the extraterrestrial immigrants of all times make reference to the terrestrial human beings, but never in such a way that terrestrial humanity was created by them, extraterrestrials. So the effective truth is that humanity on Earth has emerged as its own creation from the development of life forms on Earth itself, although certain genetic factors of extraterrestrial immigrants have remained in it from the early days of early earthly humans and also from later times, as well as Syrian gene manipulation in large parts.
And that you play, Aaron, through your teachings, try to do something against the misconduct and the mischief of the old extraterrestrial immigrants. Just by teaching and informing, you consider this simply as your obligation, because the old immigrants belong to the Nocademian descendant peoples, just like you, play, Aaron. That's the point, isn't it?
That's so, yes.
Contact Report 662 Reader Questions by Occam Wolf and the Figu Sudowich Studiengruppe of the 14th of May, 2016. Question. Did the primordial cell Luca already contain the determination of incarnation page 245 Lehrschrift, comma. The whole purpose of life is to be able to make a contribution to the evolution of creation, which, however, is only possible for the human form of life. Thus the countless species of plants and animals are to be understood as interdependent stations on the branches and branches of the evolution tree. The design of the individual life forms should be understood as the result of an adaptation to the constantly changing environmental conditions on a physical, biological and sociological level on the developing planet Earth. In the last consequence in the evolution chain flora, with an impulse consciousness, an additional evolution consciousness developed finally according to regulations a life form. With his abilities for understanding and reason, which define this form of life as a human being, it has asserted itself as the dominant earthly form of life. If Earth's environmental conditions for the evolutionary chain had been different, could a life form in water, for example, have developed an evolutionary consciousness and thus become a non-humanoid, human being? Answer Billy. Each primordial cell corresponds to a second generation, which is derived from a first generation, which the Pleeron call the primordial cell, but which is not capable of creating effective life, as it is to be understood as such. Only the second generation, that is to say the primordial cell, which today is called Luca by earthly biological science, is capable and able to develop life, as it is understood in the biological sense, according to Pleeron explanations. The very first primordial cell was formed before the later originated and life-giving primordial cell, or Luca, whereby this primordial cell consisted of the first precursors of microorganisms formed from amino acids, which according to Pleeron explanation were only the first underdeveloped, but not yet life-giving primordial microorganism forms. However, these early forms of pre-microorganisms developed further and formed into primordial cells, which expanded and multiplied in self-replication, from which the effective first microorganism life, according to human understanding, emerged. All beginnings in this way, however, were absolutely neutral form, consequently no programming etc. was present in the primordial cell, through which certain life forms, such as humans, animals, getaways etc., would have emerged. Such programs only emerged in the course of many billions of years, When the first higher forms of life in the sense of self-sufficient, independent and multifarious genera and species already existed and a fauna and diverse flora had emerged. The fauna and thus all these individuals, creatures and organisms developed inexorably and changed over the course of millions of years, as did the vegetation.